A thin gray fog clung to the forest road, turning every broken branch into something ghostly. The American convoy rolled slowly through it, engines rumbling with the tired confidence of men who had seen too much war and still expected more. Then, as if the fog itself breathed and parted, the soldiers saw them, German women standing in a trembling line, clutching empty tin cups like fragile relics. Their uniforms hung loose on their thin frames. Their eyes looked bruised by hunger. "We haven't eaten in 4 days," one whispered. The words drifted toward the Americans with unsettling repetition, as others murmured it too, each voice thinner than the last. It didn't sound like a complaint. It sounded like an exhausted confession, a truth worn raw by the march of days. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected resistance, maybe bitterness. They had not expected this line of desperate women who looked more like abandoned ghosts than enemies. The convoy braked. Boots hit the ground. Sergeant Miller, a broad-shouldered man from Ohio, approached them first. He had stormed beaches, patched his own wounds, and buried friends in the Ardennes. Yet nothing prepared him for the sight of these women with cracked lips and hollow cheeks, standing as straight as they could, as if dignity were the last thing they could still hold. Behind them, the forest waited in uneasy silence. The women seemed carved from that same stillness. Their hands shook when they tried to steady their cups. Their breath rose in thin, white strands. One clutched another's arm as if she might fall. "Where were you heading?" Miller asked, lowering his rifle. A woman with streaks of ash in her hair answered in halting English. They had been ordered to retreat days earlier. Clerks, communications workers, nurses, promised transport and rations that never arrived. Bridges were bombed. Villages burned. Trains filled with wounded thundered past without stopping. They walked until their legs felt like splintered wood. They carried nothing now except fear and the last scraps of duty. The Americans listened, expressions shifting from suspicion to something heavier, almost reluctant compassion. These women, once part of the machinery that had driven the war, were now thin shadows staring at the smell of American food drifting from the trucks. Bacon fat, coffee, bread warmed by engine heat. The contrast felt cruel. A young private muttered, "I had 2 sandwiches this morning." Another elbowed him. They stood straighter, ashamed of their full stomachs. The women seemed embarrassed by their hunger, avoiding the soldiers' eyes except when desperation overwhelmed caution. A tall woman swayed, steadied herself, then whispered again, for days, as if reminding herself it was true. Miller felt something twist inside him. War had taught him to push forward, bury one moment under the next. But here, in this frozen pocket of Europe, where the smell of oil mixed with damp pine, he felt a responsibility he hadn't expected. These weren't combatants anymore. They were simply human. He turned to his men. "Bring something," he said quietly. For a moment they hesitated, unsure if kindness counted as regulation. But rules bent easily at the sight of bone-thin women clinging to consciousness. The soldiers rummaged through packs. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, chocolate bars, small tins of rations. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they approached the line. The women recoiled at first, instincts hardened by weeks of explosions and running. But the food was warm, real, fragrant. The first woman accepted a sandwich with trembling fingers, as though expecting it to vanish. Her voice cracked when she whispered, "Danke." Something shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The Americans relaxed, shoulders lowering. The women's eyes softened, exhaustion briefly replaced by the shock of compassion. One bit into a hamburger and gave a tiny, disbelieving laugh, fragile as glass. It rippled through the line like the faintest echo of hope. Yet even as relief washed through them, uncertainty still clung to their faces. For a brief moment, the two groups stood together in muted cold. Americans in heavy jackets, Germans in uniforms worn thin by retreat, bound not by orders, but by recognition that hunger stripped away every illusion of difference. A few soldiers exchanged quiet glances, perhaps thinking of sisters or mothers back home who might look just like these women if fate had tilted the world another direction. Even the forest seemed to soften, wind gentler, as if aware something fragile was unfolding, something more human than anything the war had offered in a long time. As the convoy engines cooled and the forest settled into uneasy quiet, a distant rumble rolled through the trees, an approach, heavy and deliberate. Miller lifted his head, listening. Whatever was coming would decide the fate of these starving women, and perhaps his own. He stepped forward, rifle loose at his side, as the fog stirred once more. The rumble that drifted through the fog did not belong to thunder. It carried a mechanical growl, steady and deliberate, the kind that made soldiers straighten instinctively. The women stiffened, clutching their cups again, as though the simple gifts of bread and meat might be taken back by the next wave of fate. Sergeant Miller motioned for silence. The Americans formed a loose perimeter, not aiming their rifles, but holding them with a wary respect earned after too many surprises. The German women huddled close, the fragile warmth of their first meal in days still lingering on their tongues. From the trees emerged another column. More German women, dozens of them, stumbling in exhausted clusters. Some leaned on each other. Others dragged their feet through the mud with the lethargy of people on the edge of collapse. Their faces carried the same emptiness, the same sunken cheeks and cracked lips. When the leading woman saw the Americans, she froze, fear rippling through her like a shiver. Then she whispered the same phrase, the same haunting refrain. "We haven't eaten in 4 days." It was no longer a statement. It had become a ritual, a thin thread tying these groups together in their shared desperation. The newly arrived women stared at the half-eaten sandwiches in the hands of those who came before them, disbelief widening their eyes. Hunger radiated from them like heat from a dying fire, flickering but stubborn. Miller swallowed hard. He had known the war was ending, but he hadn't expected it to decay into this. Streams of starving people drifting through the forests like the remnants of a broken tide. His men shifted as the group multiplied, their supplies suddenly feeling like droplets against an ocean. Private Lewis, the youngest among them, took a hesitant step toward the newcomers. He held out a small can of rations, his hand trembling slightly. A woman with tangled blonde hair reached for it, but stopped midway, unsure if she was allowed. Her eyes jumped from the can to his face, searching for some hidden cruelty she had been taught to expect. He nodded gently. Only then did she accept the food, whispering a shaky "danky" that made Lewis's throat tighten. As more women approached, the Americans redistributed what little they had left. Chocolate bars were split into quarters. Sandwiches were halved. Someone offered a cup of lukewarm coffee, and the recipient cradled it as though it were a sacred relic. The forest witnessed the exchange in solemn silence. Yet, amid the heavy emotion, a flicker of awkward humor slipped through. One GI, digging through his pack, muttered, "All I got left is peanut butter. God help em." Another responded under his breath, "It's still more edible than those care ration eggs." A weary German woman overheard, blinked at the foreign phrase peanut butter, and asked softly, "Peanut butter?" The soldier shrugged. "You'll see." Her first cautious taste drew the faintest ghost of a smile, as if the absurdity alone gave her enough strength to stand straighter. Despite the momentary levity, the core tension tightened. These women were no longer merely hungry, they were terrified of what came next. The American convoy represented safety and the unknown in equal measure. They clustered around the soldiers, drawn to the food and gentleness, but wary of the authority behind the uniforms. Miller recognized that fear. He had seen it on liberated civilians, on wounded comrades, even in the mirror during the worst days. Hunger made animals out of men, but fear hollowed them into something even more fragile. He approached one of the older women, whose hands shook even after eating. "You're safe now," he said softly. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "Not yet." Her words landed with the weight of truth. The women knew the war was ending, but the end offered no promises. They had walked through burning towns, past bodies half buried in rubble, through nights of distant artillery that rattled the bones. Safety felt like a rumor, pleasant but untrustworthy. One of Miller's corporals, Hayes, knelt beside a woman who looked no more than 20. Her eyes were glassy, her breath shallow. He offered her the last of his own ration cake. She hesitated, then accepted with a tremor that wasn't entirely hunger. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Hayes blinked, surprised. "Because you need it," he said. She studied him for a long moment, confusion and disbelief swirling across her expression. Finally she nodded, almost to herself, as though trying to rewrite years of fear inside her mind. As the women ate, faint color returned to their faces. Shoulders loosened. A few even exhaled with something that resembled relief. But the forest still hummed with unease. The Americans knew they could not linger forever. The women knew they had nowhere else to go. The conflict deepened in that silent recognition. Hunger had brought them together, but what came next would test the fragile thread of humanity forming between them. When a distant engine echoed again through the trees, this time heavier, more decisive, Miller's posture sharpened. Hayes rose slowly. Lewis gripped his canteen with a tense hand. The women fell quiet, clutching their scraps of food as if holding to hope itself. Whatever approached was no small column of starving stragglers. The sound was deeper, weightier, a presence that promised change, for better or worse. Miller stepped forward, breath pale in the cold air, as the rumble grew louder and the fog began to shift once more. The vehicle that emerged from the fog was not an enemy tank, nor a column of soldiers ready to reclaim their prisoners. It was a lone American medical truck, white canvas smeared with mud, its red cross barely visible beneath layers of grime. The engine sputtered as it rolled to a stop beside the convoy. A medic climbed out first, Corporal Stanton, narrow-faced, spectacles fogged by the cold, carrying the weary posture of a man who had patched more wounds than he wished to remember. Behind him followed two assistants, both young, both startled by the sight of so many hollow-eyed women gathered like shadows around the Americans. Stanton paused, taking in the scene. He scanned the trembling figures, the way some clutched sandwiches as if afraid they might vanish, the way others leaned on their companions to stay upright. He glanced at Miller, who answered the unspoken question with a grim nod. "Starved, most of 'em," the sergeant murmured. "Some worse." The medic set down his bag with a soft thud. The women flinched at the sound, conditioned by weeks of artillery to associate any sudden noise with danger. Stanton knelt slowly, deliberately, and addressed them in gentle, fractured German. The tension in their faces eased, if only slightly. One of the younger women, a slight brunette with eyes too large for her gaunt cheeks, stepped forward unsteadily. She met Stanton's gaze with a fragile mixture of fear and resignation. When he raised a hand to check her pulse, she recoiled on instinct, breath catching in her throat. Miller crouched beside her. "He's here to help," he said softly, the words steady but warm. She hesitated, then allowed Stanton to lift her wrist. Her pulse fluttered beneath his fingers like a trapped bird. He shook his head at how weak it was. Nearby, Hayes supported the woman he had given cake to. She still swayed, though she tried to stand tall, stubborn pride flickering through her exhaustion. Hayes kept a hand at her back, ready to catch her as she fell, but respectful enough not to crowd her. She looked from him to the medic with wary confusion, whispering, "Why do you care for us now? We were your enemies." Hayes didn't speak immediately. He simply steadied her gently as Stanton examined her pale eyelids. "War made us enemies," Hayes finally said. "Hunger doesn't have to." The statement hung in the air like a fragile truth, and something shifted in her expression, an understanding she wasn't ready to trust, but could no longer ignore. The other women watched the exchange, their fear bending subtly into something quieter, more uncertain, as if human kindness was a language they barely remembered, but suddenly longed to relearn. Stanton moved from one woman to another, handing out salt tablets, checking tongues for dehydration, inspecting frostbitten fingers. He barked quiet instructions to his assistants, who hurried back to the truck and returned with blankets and small flasks of broth. The scent of it drifted through the clearing, warm, savory, impossibly comforting. The women inhaled it like a memory of life before the collapse. Lewis, still hovering close to the first group, handed out canteens one by one. A woman with silver streaks in her hair accepted hers with trembling hands. She took a single sip, then pressed the container back, murmuring in broken English, "Others first." Lewis shook his head. "No, ma'am. You drink." The insistence startled her. She looked at him as if seeing not a soldier, but a young man carrying burdens far larger than his years. Her eyes softened. She drank. And slowly, the distance between the two groups began to dissolve. The women stepped closer, not out of desperation, but from a dawning, cautious trust. The Americans responded with the unspoken understanding that combat was behind them, and something far more delicate lay ahead. Even the forest seemed to sense the change. The wind eased. The silence grew less tense, more contemplative. For the first time in days, some of the women allowed themselves to sit. One leaned against a tree trunk, whispering to another in German that she could no longer remember what warmth felt like until that moment. Another rested her head on her companion's shoulder, hands still clasped around half a sandwich she guarded as a treasure. Miller watched it all, with a heaviness he didn't show. He knew kindness carried weight. Once given, it created a bond, a responsibility. These women weren't prisoners anymore, not truly. They were survivors, fragile as thawing ice, and the Americans were now the thin barrier standing between them and the chaos of a collapsing world. He walked toward Stanton as the medic wrapped a blanket around the shoulders of the young brunette. "How bad?" Miller asked quietly. Stanton's reply was grim. "Some won't last long without proper shelter and food. They need a camp with heat, clean water. If we leave them here," he didn't finish. Miller didn't need him to. He looked over the clearing, at the faces slowly regaining color, at the women sitting closer to his men than they had an hour ago. He saw not enemies, but people who had run out of road, run out of strength, and finally run into mercy. "As soon as the convoy warms up again, we move them," Miller said. "We'll take them ourselves." Stanton nodded, relief flickering across his tired features. But before Miller could turn away, another sound rose in the distance, sharper than the earlier rumble. Engine notes layered with the metallic rhythm of multiple vehicles approaching. Lewis heard it too. His canteen hand stiffened midair. Hayes glanced toward the trees, tension returning like a breath held too long. The women reacted instantly. Those seated stumbled upright. Those eating froze, food halfway to their lips. Fear swept across their faces, quick and consuming. For a moment, the fragile trust shattered, replaced by the terror of the unknown marching toward them again. Miller stepped forward, gaze narrowing at the darkening tree line, as the rumble grew louder, closer, like the echo of a future none of them were prepared to face. The approaching engine swelled into a low, thunderous growl that pressed against the trees, shaking loose droplets of cold mist. Miller stood at the front of the clearing, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the shifting fog. The German women clustered behind the Americans, their fragile sense of safety trembling with every reverberation. Hayes moved instinctively toward them, positioning himself between the women and the sound, while Lewis tightened his grip on his rifle, not to threaten, but to steady himself against uncertainty. Out of the fog emerged a line of American transport trucks, followed by a pair of armored cars, mud-splattered, dented, and humming with the tired authority of machines that had survived one too many battles. Relief rippled through the American soldiers, but the German women remained tense. They had learned too often that salvation could look like danger until someone proved otherwise. A captain stepped out of the lead vehicle, his face stern and windburned, eyes scanning the clearing with quick, assessing precision. When he saw the cluster of starving women and the medical truck behind Miller, his expression softened, though only slightly. He approached, boots sinking into the damp forest floor. "Report, Sergeant," he said. Miller kept his voice steady. "Discovered 2 groups of German auxiliaries. Starved, exhausted, no weapons. We've been providing food and medical help." The captain looked past him at the women, thin silhouettes wrapped in blankets, trembling, cheeks hollow. One woman held a cup of broth in both hands, as if anchoring herself to the moment. Another leaned against a tree, hair matted, but eyes watchful. The captain exhaled slowly, as though absorbing the weight of their suffering. "Orders are to move all non-combatant prisoners to the transitional camp north of here," he said quietly. "But in this condition, they won't survive the transport unless we take precautions." Miller absorbed the words. The women behind him didn't understand the English, but they saw the shift in his shoulders. Fear tightened again across their faces. The young brunette Hayes had been helping took an unsteady step toward him. "Bit," she whispered, voice cracking. "Not alone. Don't leave us." Hayes translated in a hushed voice. The plea struck Miller deeper than he expected. In only a few hours, these starving strangers had become something else. People whose survival seemed tied to the fragile thread of American compassion. "We're not leaving you," Miller said firmly. His tone carried something beyond duty, a quiet promise shaped by everything the war had taken from both sides. Stanton approached the captain, speaking low. "If we load them into open transports for that distance, some won't make it. They need heat, blankets, warmth. They need handling like wounded, not prisoners." The captain considered this, glancing again at the women, at the way two leaned on each other to stay upright, at the way another blinked slowly, fighting faintness. Finally, he nodded. "Then we move them gently," he said. "And we do it now, while they still have strength." The Americans began preparing the vehicles. Blankets were spread across truck beds, tarps secured to block wind, canteens refilled, ration tins pried open for whatever warmth remained inside. Some soldiers gave up their own coats without hesitation. Others helped the women walk, offering steady arms and soft words, clumsy but sincere. A transformation unfolded, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The women, who had flinched at every sound that morning, now allowed strangers to guide them into trucks, trusting hands they never thought they would. A few even managed faint smiles when Lewis awkwardly tried to offer comfort in broken German, stringing together mismatched phrases that made them laugh through exhaustion. Stanton lifted the young brunette into the medical truck. She tried to protest, insisting others were worse off, but he shook his head. "You've carried yourself long enough," he murmured. "Let someone else carry you now." Her eyes shimmered with tears she couldn't explain. As the loading continued, the captain approached Miller. "You did right, Sergeant," he said. Not praise exactly, but an acknowledgement of the strange bridge formed in the forest, a bridge built from sandwiches, broth, blankets, and humanity rediscovered in the ruins of war. When the convoy was finally ready, the engines rumbled to life again, this time not with menace, but with purpose. The German women sat wrapped in blankets, leaning together, some closing their eyes for the first time without fear. Hayes climbed into the back of one truck, choosing to ride beside those he had helped. Lewis did the same. Miller remained outside for a moment, letting the scene settle inside him. The forest was still again, save for the soft wind brushing through the pines. Hours earlier, these women had been starving shadows murmuring the same desperate refrain. Now they were passengers on a convoy moving toward the first flicker of safety they'd known in weeks. Yet even in this fragile moment of hope, uncertainty lingered. The transitional camp would not be paradise. It would be cold, crowded, and imperfect. War's shadows would still cling to these women long after their stomachs were full. But the seed of something larger, mercy, dignity, the stubborn spark of shared humanity, had taken root. Miller climbed into the front truck beside the captain. As the convoy pulled onto the muddy road, he looked back through the rear window. The women watched the forest recede, eyes reflecting exhaustion, relief, and something harder to define. A brunette lifted her hand weakly in thanks. Hayes returned the gesture. The vehicles crawled forward, tires splashing through puddles and carving new tracks through the fading fog. The forest slowly swallowed the path behind them, as if closing a chapter none would forget. And as the last echoes of the clearing faded, Miller felt a quiet certainty settle over him. The war was ending here not with gunfire or surrender papers, but with the simple, fragile act of carrying former enemies toward life instead of death.